For those of you that do not know me, my name is Rosa Solorio. I'm Associate Dean for International and Comparative Legal Studies, and also Professor Calabro will be introducing herself shortly. But I just wanted to welcome you to this discussion. We wanted to make sure to open a space, to share with you some insights on how to conduct your job search. We know that a lot of you are doing that at this precise moment. You're either looking for full-time permanent jobs or you're looking for internships, and we want you to know that we're a resource, in the International Comparative Law Program for this capacity. So we are gonna give you some insight, on how to conduct a job search, how to prepare a cover letter, how to prepare, a resume, but we're also gonna leave plenty of time for any questions that you have. And please feel free to ask any question you have. We've been out there. We've seen a lot of things. It's normal for you to have even the most basic questions of how to navigate international and comparative law and all of the areas. All of the specialty areas, in international law when it comes to job searching. Okay, so I just want to pass the microphone to Professor Calabro.
Great, awesome. Well, thank you all for coming. For those of you that I have not met yet, my name is Leah Calabro. I'm the Visiting Associate Professor and Fellow for the ICL program. Very happy to be talking about this with you all today, something that I am very familiar with as a somewhat recent grad, so happy to share my experiences with you all. Just to jump right in, so first to start out, even before I get to strategic approaches to the job search, use your time in school wisely. My biggest advice for us students is to be a little bit strategic in your class choices, in how you spend your extracurricular time, do your best to get good grades. All of those things are going to make you more marketable in an international law area. So all that being said, now talking more specifically about how to approach an international law job search. First and foremost, use your current network. Use your fellow students who might be doing internships at places that you would be interested in. Talk to them about if they're hiring. Use your professors. Use people that you know in different fields that might know of something that could be a legal internship opportunity. You know more people than you think you do, so don't be afraid to ask for help because most people are willing to help you. Then my second piece of advice is to try to grow your network while you're here at GW. Use this time to attend the events that we host for you, attend the other events that the other programs host that are of interest to you. Also, we are in Washington, D.C., which is like the market for international law, aside from New York. New York is more private, D.C. is more public international law, so if you're interested in public international law, you're in the right spot. We're also only, a 2-hour train ride from New York, so if you are super interested in private international law and can make the trek up there for some events in New York, do it. We have opportunities for student memberships for major organizations and interest groups, so there's a flyer right back where the food was that has a little QR code for you to join the American Society of International Law. We are an academic partner, which means that you all get free student memberships. So do that. That means that you get to attend the annual meeting for a discounted price. You get to go to all of the different events that they host. They have a ton of different career-related events, but then they also do very specific subject matter webinars and really cool stuff like that. They also have interest groups within ASIL, so you can join those as well. You can join the International Human Rights Law Public Interest Group. I don't even remember all of the names of them. There's a Women in International Law Interest Group. There's a ton. So join because then you get access to all of those networks, and that is a really great way. They also have a mentorship program. Join ASIL. That is my biggest piece of advice as it relates to that. There's also the Washington Foreign Law Society, which does a lot of good events, and I believe that they have a discounted student membership as well. So while you're a student, join, meet all the people, go to the events. Like I said, student discounts to attend conferences. The 2024 American Society of International Law annual meeting is April 3rd to 6th this year, or next year, 2024. That's a really great event. There's panels on a ton of different subject areas. You meet academics, practitioners, other students from other schools. It's a really, really great opportunity. Also, informational interviews, I think, are a highly underutilized resource. Use the GW Alumni Network. Look on LinkedIn for people who have jobs that you're interested in, who have had career paths that you would be interested in, and reach out. If you can't find their GW Law email, send a message on LinkedIn and just say, like, look, I'm interested in entering this area. I see that you work there. Would you be willing to have a phone call, have a coffee for like 15, 30 minutes, and we can just, I have a bunch of questions for you. I don't think I've ever been turned down for an informational interview. Some people do, or some people just don't answer. It happens. But it's not the end of the world, and you put yourself out there, you make really great connections, and you learn a lot about what a career in this field is actually going to look like. So do that. Not even just for networking purposes, do it to educate yourself as to what you're actually going to be getting into in a career in international law. And then as you're doing all of that, you should also try to make an application plan. So be aware of your limiting criteria. This applies for both internships and post-grad jobs. You should kind of know, like, for internships, does this need to be a paid internship, or am I okay just doing this for the experience? For post-grad, what is the pay scale that I'm looking for? What region am I looking for? Am I able to travel to New York and live there permanently, or do I want to stay in DC? Do I want to go abroad? All things that you should consider as you're entering into this application process. Because what you want is just as important as what employers want, so keep that in mind. And then use all of the databases at your disposal. Use LinkedIn, use Core, use Indeed, use USA Jobs, which is the government database. Don't limit yourself to just one. Set alerts that will notify you when new postings get posted, and then you can just like immediately go on, check it out, see if you want to apply. A good system that I've found in the past is to kind of set aside a time each week to go through postings. So that way you have, like, let's say 2 hours on Friday morning, you go through the new postings and you apply for the ones that were just posted in the past week that you want to apply for. It makes it much more manageable because then you're not sitting there applying for like 60 jobs at once. You're probably just applying for like 10. Seems a lot less daunting. Next thing, tailor your application materials. So Dean Solorio is going to get a little bit more into what your cover letter, resume, writing sample, all of that should look like, but make sure that you're reading the job description. It's the same as it would be for any job. Just because it's international law doesn't mean it's that different. So for here, like, read that description, know a little bit about the organization, and be able to tailor that to match what they're looking for. I'll offer my 2 cents to this after you talk. And then really just apply. It's kind of a numbers game at the end of the day. You never know if a job is being posted that already has someone slated for it. That does tend to happen sometimes. So just put your name out there, apply. Don't be afraid to follow up, see if they need anything else. Yeah, it's really just kind of, you only need one, right? At the end of the day, just kind of cast your net wide and don't give up. Okay, so now I'm going to pass it over to Dean Solorio for the application materials.
Thank you. I echo everything that Professor Calabro said, and I just wanted to share with you a little bit of insight on internships, and applying to internships, because it's something that we really highly encourage you to do from the International Comparative Law Program. A lot of us began our careers in internships. I actually began my career being an intern for the United Nations, and that's how everything started for me in the area of international law. So I'm a big fan of them, and you are perfectly positioned, to do an internship, especially when you're graduating from GW Law School, and also because of our prime location as well. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about internships, but then also CVs and resumes, and just some tips about job searching in general. So if you think about internships, we're gravitating in the realm of international law away from a world in which you have to call somebody to get an internship, right? Most organizations now have formal internship programs, And a lot of the interns, I would say 98% of the interns are people that applied to the program, including the major international organizations like the World Bank, the United Nations, the Organization of American States. Every year we have alums, or students, ongoing students that are doing internships in these organizations, right? So don't be too daunted by this if you don't have contacts. I'm from Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, nobody does international law. I didn't know anybody in the field, right? I had to develop my own network, right? So I actually had to apply to internships, to be able to get internships, and a lot of people are like that, they don't have connections, they don't necessarily have somebody to call. So don't be daunted by that. Just apply. Like what Professor Calabro said is very, very important. The higher the number, the more probabilities that you're going to be able to get an internship. I always tell students, the preference is to be paid, but some of the best internships are unpaid, right? When I did my internships, they were unpaid, right? But they opened a door, they allowed me to create my own network, which has been very important up to today. Like at the end of the day, I still have contacts from my internships that I did 20-something years ago, okay? So this is very important. And remember, you're building a network of people that know that you work hard, that know your reputation, and you can start doing that even at the law school level, okay? And, a lot of students sometimes send me emails and they're like, do you have somebody I can call to get an internship? And I'm like, a lot of professionals do not like those calls. When I was actually at the OAS, I hated those calls. I was like, you know what? That's somebody that doesn't want to do the work. That's somebody that doesn't want to apply. If you're really serious about an institution, apply. Go through the process, even if you have contacts, because that shows something to me as a professional, somebody that's willing to work hard, to get where they want to be. So keep that in mind. It's not necessarily good to be calling people around, etc. Like networking is good, but you do have to be very careful about that, in the long term. So keep that in mind. I tell students, there's so many organizations where you can do internships, You have the major international organizations like the World Bank. I mentioned the World Bank because they're huge fans of GW Law School. A lot of the alums and high-level officials at the World Bank graduated from GW Law School. We actually are hosting a reception for them tonight, at 5 o'clock, in which the General Counsel of the World Bank is going to be here, So it just kind of gives you an idea of how close we are to the World Bank. And it's also 2 blocks away, right? So it's not a coincidence that, GW is so popular at the World Bank, but we also have students at the OAS. We have students at the IMF. We have students at the United Nations. And one thing to note about the United Nations is that, obviously there was a lot of human suffering and a lot of things that happened during the COVID-19 pandemic that we don't want to repeat, right? That we regret that they happened. But one silver lining is that now we have all these virtual internships, that we didn't have at our disposal before. So if you're interested in working for a place like the United Nations, it's not just whatever you have available in Washington, D.C. There's also a lot of virtual internships as well. We have students, for example, that have done internships with Geneva, for example, and they're based in Washington, D.C. or other countries. So don't foreclose those possibilities because you could have a really good opportunity doing something virtual. Civil society organizations are huge in the Washington, D.C. area, right? And foundations as well, And there's, in many areas of the law and of international law, you'll find civil society organizations. I just name a few, especially if you're thinking of human rights careers, because I know many of you have told me that this is an area that for you is of interest. We have the Center for Justice and International Law, the Due Process of Law Foundation, the RFK Human Rights Project, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Human Rights First. I mean, there's an entire array, and they all have formal internship application programs, So I really encourage you to explore them. The experience is fabulous, in civil society organizations because they don't have a lot of staff. So you get a lot of responsibility early on, which is beautiful, when you're doing, internships. And remember that we also have law firms, we also have the federal government. The federal government is an incredible employer. In the Washington, D.C. area, some of the best international law work is done at the federal government level. We have students, that work at the federal government, So just keep those opportunities in mind as well. You can request informational interviews, as Professor Calabro indicated. I do think this is very useful. Remember not to ask for a job when you are in an informational interview. People do not like to be asked for jobs. And the reason why they don't want to be asked for jobs is because more often than not, they cannot give you a job. They don't necessarily have the power to do so, right? So if you ask somebody for an informational interview, keep it very professional. You're just asking about themselves, how they got into that career path, the kind of work that they do. People like talking about themselves, so ask them about themselves. Find ways to connect with the person, try to develop a relationship, cultivate a relationship with that person, over time. That all pays off, when it comes to networking, but it's not a good moment to ask for a job, okay? You can ask about application processes, right? You can ask about possibilities of internships, but I wouldn't ask for a job per se, okay? Other things, get to know your professors in the law school. We have some of the most high-level international law experts in the world teaching at this law school. We're very lucky. I mean, our international comparative law faculty is incredible. It's unmatchable. This is why we're one of the top 10 programs in the United States, and it's not just the full-time faculty, but the adjunct faculty. It's incredible the personalities that we have teaching at this law school. So I tell students, go to office hours, develop a relationship with your professors, Your demeanor, your professional demeanor in a class is extremely important. This is not just about grades, it's how you project yourself. You're training yourself to be a professional in this area, so please keep this in mind. And students always laugh when I say this. Even if your professor gives you a bad grade, a grade that you're not happy with, try not to make enemies of your professors, because these can be contacts for you in the future, and please realize that grading can be very difficult. We do a lot of grading. Unfortunately, we have to curve. We can't always give you a high grade. So it's something to keep in mind, that those professional connections can last a lifetime. I'm still friends with a lot of my professors from law school, believe it or not. And this was 20-something years ago, okay? So it's something to keep in mind. In terms of your CV, one-pagers can be good, especially in the U.S. context. And the reason why we're always saying one-pagers is because usually when somebody is reviewing your CV, they don't have a lot of time. So for example, if you apply to a specific employment place and they have 500 applications, it's best to have everything, in that one-pager. And you want to make sure that you showcase very quickly, what you bring to the table, okay? So please keep that in mind, when you're building your resumes. When you have more experience, you can have a longer resume, right? And it also depends on the market. If you want to be in the teaching market, usually teaching market, is a much longer resume, right? Than for a law firm or for the federal government, etc. But it is good to work on that one-pager, especially if you have less than 5 years of professional experience. After 5 years, the resume starts getting a little bit longer, and that's completely normal. You want to highlight your education, that's very important. You want to highlight anything that you did in law school that could be connected to that employer. So for example, courses that you took in the law school that are connected to that area of the law. Writing samples, honors, grades, law school associations, journals, student activities, scholarships. A lot of you have scholarships, very prestigious scholarships to be studying here. It's good to highlight that because that's a measure of achievement that you already have, right? In your academic life, but also your professional life. Make sure you list your internships. This is very important as well, or other kinds of experiences that you think could be useful. If you are a research assistant, to a professor, huge credential, please put it because, employers look at that a lot. Publications, I always tell students, if you want to do a career in international law, start publishing young. Every expert in the international law field is very well published. It's something that we share. Right? We all like writing, we all like commenting, we like publishing, so it's a good idea to start thinking about how to publish. And I tell students, you don't necessarily have to get a placement in law review to do that. We have actually a lot of students that are placing super well in journals that they just worked for a paper in a specific class. For example, I teach research paper courses, and a lot of my students actually go on and publish their papers eventually. And they have very good placements, in U.S. law reviews and journals, right? So you don't necessarily have to place in a law review to do that. To the contrary, we have a student, for example, a graduate of this law school, an LLM graduate, who just published a piece at the Harvard Journal of International Law. one of the most selected journals in the country. And she hasn't been out of law school for that long. And the piece is beautiful. It's incredible. This is why it got published, right? So please, and she wasn't in a law review when she was in law school, okay? So just letting you know that there's ways to do this without having to necessarily be in a law review. And also short publications count too. Blocks count, insights count, like shorter publications. Other skills that can be important, especially in the international sphere, if you have any languages, it's good to list them. But one thing that I always tell students with languages, if you're gonna list languages, it's a language that you're basically at a native speaker of or completely fluent, to work with. The reason why I say this is because you don't wanna be in an interview and suddenly the interviewer starts blurting questions on that language and you cannot answer them. If you cannot answer questions, it's probably a good idea to say, proficient, working level, but don't say fluency. Because if you say fluency, you may get somebody in an interview that suddenly starts blurting questions and you're gonna expect it to be fluent. So it's not a good idea to exaggerate your languages. And let me tell you, tons of international law experts do not speak another language. So you can make it in this field without speaking languages. But if you have them, especially for those regional jobs. For example, I'm a native speaker of Spanish. A lot of my career has gravitated towards Latin America. Spanish obviously was a big credential for that, okay? So keep that in mind. When it comes to the resume, clarity and good proofreading, very important. We notice mistakes. I used to be in practice and I used to hire a lot of people per year. I noticed mistakes right away. Right? So it's very, very important to proofread your resume very well. Mistakes don't speak highly of you. If you make them in a resume, that means that you're going to make them in any sort of writing that you're going to submit to that employer, so it doesn't give a good impression. And clarity is very important as well, okay? And also concise, make it concise, not so wordy. I think that also helps. In terms of cover letters, you want to highlight in a cover letter what you cannot highlight in a resume. Right? I call it the intangible, right? What you don't necessarily find in a resume. Why do you want that job? Why are you passionate about that area of the law? Why do you think you would be a good fit, right? What's special about you? Why should they interview you and not other people? That's the kind of thing that you want to highlight in a cover letter. You want to make sure that, your interest in that job jumps out of the page. Why do you want to do this, right? Keep in mind that a lot of employers don't review cover letters, right? So make sure you spread out things too in your applications, make sure that your resume has enough, right? Because sometimes employers don't look at cover letters, but sometimes they do, right? So you want to make sure that you do a good job with that cover letter. Passion is important, especially in specific areas of international law. I've worked for a really long time in human rights. For me, passion is huge. It's bigger than where you went to school, what your grades are, what your honors are. If I don't see that passion and that commitment when I was hiring, I just didn't interview you. I wanted people that I knew were going to be great with clients, that were going to be great with the work, that they were not going to get discouraged by how hard human rights work can be, right? So you want to make sure, that, you project what you can bring to the table. Especially if you think your grades are not that great, especially if you think, that you don't have that much experience, this is your opportunity to shine, right? So a good cover letter, can be really useful, when it comes to your job searching. Concentrations can be key. Now we are in a moment in international law where everything is super specialized. We offer a number of concentrations in the program. You can actually have a JD concentration in international comparative law. You can have one in international business law. You can have, if you're an LLM, you can have one in human rights. You can have one in international arbitration. The reason why we created those concentrations is because a lot of employers were telling us, we like this. These are students that we know are really invested in this area, that is worth for us to actually, train these students, and actually they have aptitude in the area. And that's something that you can also cover in a cover letter as well. I wouldn't do more than one page for a cover letter, to be honest with you. You could be a beautiful writer, but most people that are, hiring for jobs, they don't really have the time to look at a cover letter, very closely. So one page. Make sure that, 2 paragraphs, 2 well-crafted paragraphs, and then a signature at the end, and remember to include information that's not in your CV, right? If you have if you come from a country that you think is very connected, to the work that you're going to be doing, for example. Anything that you think could be important for the employer, you include in the cover letter. Writing samples. Work very carefully on your writing samples. The reality is that when you're out there practicing as an attorney, probably your writing is the most important skill that you have, that you bring at the table. It gives you influence, it gives you opportunities, it gives you impact. I always tell, students that the more you can work on your writing, the better. It opens a lot of doors. When you're a really good writer, people want to give you work, right? And that's how you advance, in a career in the area of international law. So think very carefully about the writing sample you're going to send to an employer. Make sure it's very well proofread, that is very well edited. We have a writing center that can review and give you tips, if you're not quite sure of your writing sample. Make sure you don't pick anything too polarizing as a writing sample. And I know that it's very difficult in the current state of the world not to write about something polarizing, but the reality is that you don't want to turn off, your future employer, right? So you don't want to pick something that's too explosive or bombastic, right? And this is, not a question of disrespecting your views, etc. It's just that you don't know who's going to read it, right? So you don't want to turn off employers right off the bat just because you wrote about something that's bombastic for that specific employer, okay? So please keep that in mind, when you're working on your writing samples. It's up to you. It's your discretion. A lot of the work that I do is polarizing. I work on women's rights issues, right? So there's a lot that I write that I know is not everyone's cup of tea, right? So I understand you. I hear you. I respect it. It's just that when you're looking for a job, it's good to be careful about that. You don't want to be left in a weeding out process just because you presented something that's about something so bombastic, that they're like, oh, I don't know if I'm going to be able to, to work with this person, okay? You want to pick something that's a good topic of conversation. I've been to a lot of interviews that they pick my writing, that suddenly they pick my resume and they start talking about my publications. And they pick the most interesting ones. Ooh, tell me about this one. Why did you write this? Why this is important for you? So you want to pick something that's interesting, that makes you look like, wow, this is a person that's an innovative thinker, a groundbreaking thinker. You want to pick something interesting. Very well researched. That's very important with writing samples. A lot of the value of writing, especially later in life, in international law, is the quality of sources that you include, the quality of footnotes, thorough research, right? So make sure that that's reflected, in your writing as well. A few things about preparing for a job search. I always tell students, your credentials in the area of international law start now, right? That's not something that you develop overnight, right? And even if you start and you graduate and you start with a job that's not related to international law, that follows you throughout your career, So anything that you can do related to international law now is a really good thing. Like, for example, joining student associations, pursuing concentrations, doing the Oxford program. We have the Oxford Summer Program, writing in the area of international law, taking courses in the area of international law. All of that those are all important credentials. Doing JESSOP, Professor Calabro can tell you about JESSOP. She's basically done everything that you can do in the law school on international law. And I think that has helped her a lot with her success, in this area. Remember also ASIL, as Professor Calabro said. I'm in the executive council of ASIL. We really, really, really want more young members. And we pay for an academic partnership from the program, which means that membership for you is for free, which is so great. This is new. ASIL has this now, and they have an entire set of career-related events, right, aside from programming. So it's a way for you to stay up to date with programming and what's happening in the area of international law, but also they have a lot of career advising activities, and also, as Professor Calabro indicated, the networking is off the charts in a place like ASIL. I mean, even me, when I go to the ASIL annual meeting, I'm like this. I can't believe this person is here in Washington, D.C. Oh my God. There's so much of that going on in ASIL. Basically, a lot of the high-level experts on international law get together and convene in ASIL. So it's a really great place to get to know people, to develop a name, get involved in interest groups. People do look at who's involved in ASIL or not. It's kind of like saying, I am invested in this area, so I highly recommend it. And I also wanted to say, just to close, I give a lot of advising to many of you. And many of you really, really, really want to stay in Washington, D.C. And I understand why. It's an amazing city. There's a lot happening in Washington, D.C. But something that's very important for you to know is that a lot of international law work happens outside of Washington, D.C. And I would dare to say that a lot of the best jobs are outside of Washington, D.C. In Geneva, in New York, in the field. So keep that in mind, that if you're really, really interested in this area, Washington is one place, but it's definitely not the only one, right? Most of us didn't start in Washington. I mean, I started actually in Ecuador with the United Nations, and then I worked in New York, right? So at the end of the day, you don't necessarily start here, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? So keep that in mind. Geneva is incredible. Geneva is incredible. So many organizations that do international law in Geneva. A lot of activity related to international law. The New York world is incredible. The United Nations and civil society, there's so many nonprofits in New York. It's really incredible, So it's okay to be open, to leave the city. You don't necessarily have to stay in the city to do international law. The same applies for internships, keep that in mind, So it's just something to think about, right? The world doesn't have to be as narrow as the city, right? And the other thing I wanted to close with is it's completely okay to do work in the U.S., domestic. Like a lot of students, they're like, I'm fascinated with international law. So I want all my jobs to be in the area of international law. Most practitioners, that's not the case. Most practitioners have some national level experience. They either did clerkships, in the U.S., for example, and that could be at the federal or state court level. They work for law firms. A lot of students, when they graduate, they work for law firms, right? I worked for a law firm for 2 years. I had student loans, So, I mean, and I didn't do international law work in that law firm. I actually did labor and employment and did a subset of immigration work. That was my practice, right? And then I entered the United Nations world and things like that. It's completely okay to be a prosecutor, to be a public defender, to work as an attorney in a law firm, to work for the federal government. Just keep that in mind, because when you're looking for jobs, you don't necessarily have to step out of law school with the perfect international law job to eventually have a career in this. And in some areas, like for example, international criminal law, a lot of those judges, are former prosecutors. A lot of those judges at the international level and the international tribunals are former prosecutors, or even former judges at the national level who got this criminal law expertise first at the national level before they took it to the international law level. I've seen tons of human rights attorneys, that started at the national level and then went to the international level and then they went back to the national level, right? So keep that in mind, that the fact that you're interested in international law doesn't mean that you're always going to be, doing something completely international. Sometimes you're going to want to do something in your country, whether it's the U.S. So there's nothing wrong with having a foot in your country. I'll give you an example. One of my favorite courses to teach at the law school is Fundamental Issues in U.S. Law, right? Some of my former students are here. Does the course cover international law? Not really. It's more U.S. constitutional law, right? And I'm an international law expert, right? So at the end of the day, you never know when you're going to be connected, to your own country. So it never hurts to have 2 or 3 years of experience in your own country, just in case you want to return, just in case you want to come back, There's a big relationship between, national law and international law, and that can be reflected in your career as well. So don't be discouraged, if you really, really want that international law job, but your first job after graduation is a law firm doing litigation, you can use that later. Most international litigation, you need to know how to be a litigant first, a good litigant first before you actually take it internationally. So keep that in mind also, when you're doing your job search. And I want to stop there so that you ask any questions you have. And please know that we're a resource, and we'll do career office hours next spring. We'll have also more career-related events like this, and you have our support. We know this can be a very difficult field to navigate, but we have a lot of very successful alums, so please keep that in mind, when you're in your down days and discouraged. We do know a lot of people that graduated from this law school that are doing fantastic, international law work, okay? So keep that in mind.
I have 2 additional tips that came to mind while you were
Yes,
talking.
please.
So as far as CV resume, I definitely submit the one page to employers, but I encourage you all to have a fully fleshed out, like pages long of all of your experience. Because then when you look at the job posting, you see that the job you had right before law school is really relevant. So you can just copy and paste and form this brand new resume that is completely tailored to that position. And it makes it just way easier. You don't have to pull from your memory, like, what were my responsibilities 3 years ago? You just have this running document of things that you can pull from, and it just makes your life a whole lot easier. And then as far as cover letter, I think the biggest mistake I see people make is talking about what the job is gonna do for them. Your cover letter is not about that. Obviously, you're all thinking about it because that's important, but in your cover letter, you have to make sure that you make it clear what you're bringing to the employer. Passion is a big one, like Dean Solorio said, and that is absolutely something that you're bringing to the job. It is something that's close to your heart as well, but you're bringing it to the table. And just make sure you're selling yourself, selling your skills, rather than saying, this job is gonna allow me to do this, because I think that kind of can be a big turnoff for employers. So just be careful in kind of the language that you use in your cover letter. Yeah, those are my two. So now we can do questions, yeah.
So exactly that. How does one convey passion in a cover letter? Because I find just saying, "Oh, I'm really passionate about this position," can come off as being somewhat false in contrast.
Well, I mean, you have to research the organization, right? That's number one. And that's a mistake that a lot of people do. Like, they just have a form cover letter and they send the same cover letter everywhere. You have to research them and find areas that you really like in the organization, and you highlight those, right? Something that you really feel that you could be a contributor, or that, you really want to work with, and something that you really think that you can make a mark, right? And research comes in handy there, right? Knowing what the organization really does, the kind of work, some of the kind of work that you're going to be doing. I mean, I think that helps, project that passion as well.
And I think having the demonstrated interest in school helps, because you can say, like, I'm extremely passionate about this. I've taken 6 classes on this subject. Like, I'm involved in this research project on this topic. That shows demonstrated passion and interest. Another thing, don't be afraid to, like, pull from personal experience. Like, so my background is in Holocaust studies, and I wrote a cover letter about how when I was 8, I went to the Holocaust Museum in DC, and that, like, triggered this lifelong passion, and that got me a job. Like, don't be afraid to pull from things like that do show, like, I'm not just making this up. Like, I did this thing that has carried me through. Like, that can be, showing some personality is not a bad thing in your cover letter.
I was wondering if you could talk about international law firms and sort of how that works. Is it similar to traditional law firms, and like, do they take summer associates and interns and things like that?
Well, you have the formal process, which is managed, a lot of it is managed through our career services office, right? But you also have the informal process, right? My big advice with those international law firms, is that you have to figure out spaces where they need you, right? That's where what you bring to the table can be useful to them, So, for example, if you grew up in Latin America, you apply to law firms that have strong Latin America teams, right? And you apply to those that they're gonna, they're really gonna be able to use what you bring to the table. In your particular case, look for law firms that are really big on energy and environment, for example. That's a really big thing right now. Like, it's good to try to, instead of just doing a general search, to kind of say, okay, where could I fit in? Where could I bring in an expertise that they don't necessarily have, right? Especially in that informal process, right? You have the more formal process in which all students, apply, right? And there's specific markers, that do count a lot in that process, right? But there's also the informal process, right? And you have people that get jobs, both ways. And another thing about law firms, that a lot of you should know, is that law firms really value specialties after a certain time. So I don't know if you came to our trade event. We had an international trade event about a week ago, in which we had these high-level authorities from the State Department talking about their work in international trade and some law firm partners. and they were talking about how difficult it is to find international trade experts. So difficult, and that they're constantly hiring, but they don't necessarily have, there's not necessarily enough attorneys that bring that expertise, right? And I've noticed that, international trade for me is a huge area. It's a wonderful area, but a lot of students don't want to go into it because they're daunted by the language and the lingo, but it's actually one of the areas where you can speak a language that nobody else can speak, which can make you employable for those law firms, right? And a lot of those international trade experts don't start in law firms. They start in the government or they start in other institutions, and then they eventually gravitate into law firms. So keep that in mind that at the end of the day, a lot with law firms is, tailoring yourself, to law firms that really need what you bring to the table, right? And building specialties that are appealing to them. And there's always a lot of value in specializing in things that don't have a lot of people in them, okay? And I know that's very hard, when you're a student, everybody wants to do this specific area of the law because it's so great. Well, at the end of the day, you also have to be practical in that sense, like right now, artificial intelligence is a huge thing. Technology is a big thing, right? We know that's a big area right now for law firms and not many experts and a big area, right? So it's also good to think in those terms, where's the void and where can I fill in the void and how can I distinguish myself from this huge number of people that are going to be applying to those law firms, So keep that in mind also, because that counts at the end of the day, especially in those areas that not a lot of people are doing, right? And that's something that you learn with time, right? At the end of the day, even me, like I started human rights as a gender person, and now I'm kind of in like 5 different areas of law. And that has been by need, there are voids in human rights, and I've been trying to fill specific voids as I move along, so that's part of also being in international law,
Sorry, but just as a follow-up on that as well, I know that this is probably different for most people in this room and very dependent on what your own experiences are. But as far as trying to break into the field of public international law, with this LLM, do you think it's better to start going for internships, or is it possible to apply for more senior positions?
I mean, it's not that it's impossible to get senior positions. It's just that employers have preferences for people they know, right? So internships are good because they get to know you. That's what it is. It's not that it's impossible, right? It's just that if you have been an intern or they have had contact with you already and they know you're good, they would much rather hire you, right? And the thing with a lot of employers, especially in international organizations and civil society organizations, is like, first of all, there's not that many positions that open, right? It's very difficult to fire people also, right? So you want to make sure you hire somebody that you have kind of like a level of like knowledge of, that you were like, okay, I know that this person is going to be a good employee. Remember that not every employee is good, right? So, and I remember being on that end, right? And being so careful with selection processes because I was like, after the person is here, they're here, right? So it's something to keep in mind. It doesn't mean that it's impossible to get senior positions. It's just that usually to get senior positions, you do need a few years of experience and a reputation. And this is where the reputation comes in, where your work or your body of work comes in, right? That you want to start building that since young so that after 5 years of experience, you have an entire body of work, right? And that does count, especially when it comes to those senior positions, I think, were there questions over here? No? And over here? Laura.
I have a question to do with, so how can you navigate or remain within the sphere of international law when a lot of employers are in the international sphere are more policy advanced?
Well, some of the best work is policy, and the reality is that if you are working, for example, for any government, the odds are that you're combining law and policy in some way. And a lot of people in international start in policy jobs. Remember, not everything is legal, right? So if you get like a really good international policy job, that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? What I always tell people is like, especially in those first 2 or 3 years, it's a good idea to get some sort of legal practice so that you learn how to be a lawyer, because it's very hard to learn how to be a lawyer later, right? But if you get a great international policy job, I would encourage you to take it, because half of what you're going to be doing is policy anyway. Even if you're in a legal job, there's going to be so much about international policy that it's good experience anyway, you know? And a lot of the best jobs are actually very connected to policy, you know? So I would encourage you to pursue that too.
Yeah, and like the biggest attorney skill you can have is research and writing, and you're going to be doing that policy or legal. So yeah, you're getting that skill.
A lot of these more public interest international positions, the timeline for hiring for summer positions, for example, is slated a lot later than maybe our friends who are doing like big law M&A work. So at what point, and this might sound a little crude, at what point during the year do you go, all right, this is like late for even by the standard of this process, and maybe I'm gonna be in a position where I'm gonna take a position or look for positions that aren't exactly what I was hoping for, but I need a summer position and this is what I'm gonna do, and just kind of what we should expect about that later timeline going into spring.
It's a wonderful question. And what a lot of people do is they will take the summer associate position in the law firm, you know, if they haven't been able to secure anything else. And then if they secure something else, even in the middle of the summer, they negotiate. Can I go and be an intern for this place for 2 or 3 weeks, right? You know, and I've seen a lot of people do that in law firms, actually, that they get the opportunity in June. And suddenly they're like, I should do this for 2 or 3 weeks. Let me see if there's a way to manage this with my summer associate position. There's nothing wrong with working for law firms. I always tell students, you know, I know law firms can be very difficult to work at, hours and the demands, but they teach you how to research, how to write, how to work under pressure. You know, they teach you how to blue book, right? How to produce a written document that doesn't have mistakes. I learned a lot from the law firm, I have to say. After I went into the United Nations, nobody taught me anything. You know, when you're in a law firm, you get taught how to do a lot of things, right? So there's nothing wrong with doing that for a while, right? You know, and remember that at the end of the day, you're developing a body of work, right? So if a future employer sees a CV that's full of international law things, even though you're working at this law firm that you're doing domestic work, they're like, oh yeah, her heart is in this. It's just she's trying to find the right opportunity. And it's completely normal, especially when you're under 5 years of experience, to be still trying to find, you know, the opportunity. The reality is that dream jobs usually come later in life, much later, you know? So keep that in mind, you know, that you're not hurting yourself. We all have to eat, right? So I always tell students, you know, like, it's not necessarily useful to just pursue the perfect when you have a good opportunity in front of you. You know, sometimes it's good to take the opportunity, right? Make the best of it, right? And then you keep on building a body of work that will eventually get you where you want to be. And this is where organizations like ACEL really help you. When you go to these interest groups, you see people that are not doing international law at all under 5 years of experience, but this is really where their passion is, and they're just keeping the flame alive, right? You know, they're doing a national job, but they're like, okay, I'm staying involved, so people see this is what I want to do eventually. And there's a lot of that going on, you know, in any field of the law, right? You know, so at the end of the day, you're not hurting yourself doing that. And, you know, just make sure you develop a body of work, right? You know, that you don't put it aside, you know, and that's where your writing comes in. If you're still publishing really good work in the area of international, somebody's going to look at that eventually. Like, so keep that in mind, you know, that there's a way of building this body of work without having to sacrifice your need for a job, right? You know, it's better to have a job that's not necessarily your preferred job than to not have one. So keep that in mind. Remember, you can get really useful skills in any job, you know, to be an attorney later. And the fact that you start in a specific job doesn't mean that you're going to end in a specific job. Most of us in international law, if you would have asked me 20-something years ago, oh yeah, you're going to be like at GW Law School, dean of this program, I would have laughed. You know, like I would have been, what? Really? Academia? What? Like, you know, you don't necessarily end where you start. So keep that in mind too, you know, and this is where flexibility comes in too. There's a lot of wonderful things that life can throw at you in the way that are great to do, and you're not even thinking about them right now. So keep that in mind too, you know.
Another good option for summer internship would be to clerk for a judge. That's, I think, sometimes those schedules are more flexible, so you might be able to negotiate a little bit easier. And also if you're like you're like me and really opposed to working at a firm, then that could be a better, just depending on what you want. But even another example, I was at the ASIL mid-year meeting this past, and so there was someone there who was working for the DA's office in Philly and like not working in international law, but she was there doing her thing, networking, trying to get back into it. So, yeah.
And she had a great job.
Yeah.
She's an assistant DA, which is a great job, you know? So, but you can tell her heart is in that. She specialized on international, so she's trying to stay involved. I thought it was super smart. You'll probably see her in a really good job internationally very soon, you know? So there's a lot of different ways of doing this, you know? You don't necessarily have to start with the Office of Legal Advisor of the State Department. That can come later. That comes later to a lot of people. It doesn't come right away necessarily, okay?
I want to ask you both, and thank you for this opportunity and all these reflections and tips. Really, I really appreciate this moment. And I wanted to ask you both. I want to work with children's rights. That's my passion and education. And what do you think my position would you do to improve your skills and maybe find something or some job to work with this promoting children's rights?
Well, one wonderful thing about children's rights is that it's one of the best funded international law fields. There's so much funding for children's rights issues, and you have very, very well-known organizations that do children's rights too, aside from UNICEF, of course. You know, you have World Vision, you have Plan International, Save the Children. I mean, there's like so many of them, right? You know, so I do think having an internship in one of them is a really good idea. They do value government experience a lot, you know, in those organizations. I think writing about children's rights is always useful. It's always valued. You know, you always see publications on children's rights issues. You know, I think at the end of the day, a lot of it is like getting your foot in the door on that field of children's rights. And I have to say, I know a lot of people that have done internships, and that's how they have gotten into those organizations at the end of the day, you know. And UNICEF is one of the biggest employers in the world. It's known for being one of the best run United Nations agencies as well. So they have a very, very good and strong internship program too, you know. And a lot of the officials at UNICEF work in the government at some point or the other. Because they work a lot with national protection systems, with policies, you know, they work with a lot of issues that you eventually can take at international level. So that's a great place to look at as well, you know.
And a lot of those organizations have events as well. So go to their websites, watch to see, are they doing webinars? Are they doing things like that? So that way you have something that you can like point to if you ever get an interview or something. You'd be like, well, I've been like really on top of this issue, and I know you hosted a webinar that was really great, and it shows like you're invested in that organization, you're invested in that issue.
Such quiet
I
group.
know. I was just
I'm like, usually when we do this, it's like, Gianluca, please.
So I think this might not be so relevant right now, but as far as the progression of one's career in public international law, generally speaking, does one find oneself staying in the same organization for extended periods of time, or is there a lot of movement between different fields?
There's a lot of movement. At least, I mean, there's people that you will find, right, that stay in the same organization and they move up through the ranks, but most people, their careers are not very linear. And I don't even think it's a question of like that they don't want them to be linear. It's just that they're interested in specific topics, opportunities, you know, open up. People move countries, you know, like you're working in one country and then you want to move to another one. Like there's a lot of movement that I think is intrinsic to the area, right? And it's completely okay to move. And remember, your career doesn't have to be linear, you know? Like I think one of the wonderful things right now is that you don't have to necessarily do the same thing for 20 years, right? You know, you can actually do different things, and, you know, I think most people move around from what I've seen, you know.
You also will get to a point, hopefully, in your career where you start being approached with opportunities. So it's not really you seeking out, searching, but like you are given this great opportunity and why would you not do it? I think the other tough thing with international law compared to, I don't know, mergers and acquisitions or something more law firm related is like we don't have a direct path. Like there's not a first year associate, second year associate, you work your way up to partner, you become named partner. Like we don't have this set pathway, but that it's like daunting because you don't really know, like, am I making the right decisions? Am I going the right way? But it's also really flexible. Like you can make this pathway whatever you want it to be. I don't know any two people in this field that have had the exact same step-by-step process. Yeah, so it's, you can't make a bad decision necessarily. Yeah.
Any questions? What a quiet
I
group.
know.
It's incredible. I've never seen this.
Well, we did one of these last semester as well, and there were a lot of questions in that one, and that is on our YouTube page. So if you just aren't thinking of them in the moment and want to go watch the recording of last semester's and see what other people asked, feel free. Sabrina.
This is more for the people to actually know, I guess, how many did you apply for? I remember when I was applying, I applied for like 50, 60 jobs, but just so that people have an idea, like what was your experience on that?
Well, so when I graduated, I think I graduated without a job. I was one of the people, JD, no job. And I think from like spring through up until I got hired in August, I probably was like nearing 70, 80, yeah. And I did not get a job in international law. My first job out of law school, I was doing like fraud work. Not my favorite. So it doesn't, but then I landed here. So like your first job really does not make or break where your career is headed. Don't panic about that. I got to the point where I was like, I had bills to pay. And that was the decision I had to make. So yeah, it just kind of, don't stress. That's my biggest, you're gonna find your way where you wanna be at some point, and you might make some lefts and rights along the way, but you'll get there.
Sabrina, I've sent hundreds of applications in my career, and I've had a lot of no's, just so you know, lots of no's.
Or no response.
Yeah, lots of no's or no response. Like, you know, I've kind of, like at this point, I'm just like, whatever, you know? Like, it's kind of like, you know, you kind of learn how to handle that, right? And keep in mind also that, you know, and I know this sounds really corny, but when a door closes, another one opens. That's really true, you know? And you know, you just have to kind of like, you know, develop a system where you're like, I'm good enough and I'm gonna get a job. It's just gonna take some time. And I know it's very difficult to think that way, because when you want to get that job, or when you need that job, it can be really complicated, you know. But at the end of the day, eventually it does happen for you, you know. So you just have to get used to not taking it personally. The reality is that you're all wonderful. You're here because you've done already something good. Remember that, right? It's very difficult to be in a U.S. law school, you know, working at the level that you're working, you know. So don't take it personally, you know, if they say no to you for jobs or they don't answer. Remember that sometimes employers are getting 500 applications, 600 applications, you know. So you can be amazing, but there's 500 people, right? You know. So keep that in mind. Don't take it personally. It's just the nature of the beast. You know, and the reality is that, from my experience, if you're a hardworking person and you work on your craft, you know, you will eventually get what you want, right? You know, so keep that in mind. You know, it will happen for you. It's just that the timing doesn't necessarily happen, you know, when you want it to happen. You know, there's growing pains. We've all had growing pains, you know, but it's an amazing career. You know, it's something that after you're doing it, you're like, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this, you know. Really great. It can be a lot of fun, you know. It's just that it takes some time, you know. So don't be daunted by the 100 applications, 150 applications, you know. At the end of the day, as Professor Calabro said, you need one. Just need one, you know, at the end of the day, and don't take it personally. This is not about you. This is about the field, you know, how the field is, and you just keep on, and you just have to move forward. I always tell students, you know, I've had a lot of disappointing times, you know, and you know what? Gotta keep on moving forward. You cry a little bit and you move forward, you know? So keep that in mind, you know? And it's good to develop that kind of skill young, right? Because today you want an internship. Tomorrow you want to be the director of something. and you're up with 1,000 people, right? So it's a good idea to kind of develop those skills since you're young.
How would you advise a person who's really interested in international law, but would like to or has to settle near their hometown, home country, where the access to international law organizations is somewhat restricted?
Well, that's a wonderful question, Philip. And the reality is that there's a lot that happens now virtually.
Yeah.
Like a lot of civil society organizations, the employees don't work on site, And I'm talking about places like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, like they have a number of employees that do work on site and a number of employees that work remotely. And there's tons of organizations like that, that you can work with. So you don't necessarily have to be in a specific place anymore. And the other thing is academia. Everywhere in the world has universities, and a lot of the best work in international law is done in academia, So that's another possibility to explore, potential fellowships, teaching positions. A lot of the international law work is done in the academic sector, So keep that in mind. Consulting. There's a lot of consulting going on. Most of the consultants that I've worked with, and I've also been a consultant, are not based in the place where you're doing the consultancy, right? So there's ways of getting creative without having to necessarily be in New York or Geneva. So keep that in mind. Consulting is very popular, and it's great because you get to do such great work. You have flexibility. It pays well, right? And you don't necessarily have to be, in a specific place to do it, So keep that in mind, that there's no, it's not like beforehand that you needed to be in like 3 or 4 cities and that was it. Most of the people I work with are not even based where they're working, So keep that in mind. Lots of people in Europe, and the reality, and not in Geneva, So
Nobody can afford to live there.
Exactly. A lot of them in Spain, for example. There's a lot of people, that are directing huge programs for civil society organizations that live in Spain. And Spain doesn't have that many civil society organizations, but a lot of them live in Spain, right?
And Europe has great research institutes, like the Max Planck Institute for International Law.
Yeah.
Amazing. Yeah. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of good options.
So keep that in mind that you can get creative. You don't necessarily have to be in a specific place to do this. Academia can be an interesting option. I have to say, you can do amazing work from academia on international law. So keep that in mind too,
Any last questions?
Yes.
More of a comment on the policy side, as someone who's kind of been in that space for many years. I think for those who are interested in government jobs, there's like a plurality of places to go. And if you are looking into that, USA, having your stuff prepared in advance is always really critical, especially, on USA jobs. And that's where I put that out there.
Very wise words coming from a very experienced voice, I have to say. A beautiful career, the one that you have in the area. Any other comments?
No? Okay, cool. Hopefully you're all on our listserv. I will send out what our office hours will be for next semester, probably like early January.
And we send information also on job opportunities. So keep on the lookout.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
I'll just find it. And then I'll tell you more.
I was like, I'm just here trying to get to next week.
Exactly. I'm just trying to live it.
Let me know where you end up staying.
Yes.
All right, sounds good. I'll see you.
I'll see you in a little bit.
Gripada, tô rouca. Tô cansada. Hi, how are you doing? When is your the webinar is next week. Next week. When?